Abutavach. Rabbi soll gesund sein, began the Farbrengen this afternoon. For this Shabbos is Shabbos Mevorchim of the month of Menachem Av. In general, we Farbring every Shabbos Mevorchim, but every month has its specialty. And the specialty of today's month is the fact that it's the month of Menachem Av. And here the Rebbe quoted Pasuk Zeh Ashar LaHashem Tzadikim Yavoy Yavoy. There are certain inyanim that have to come on to a gate. Shar LaHashem. In other words, all of the inyanim that happen will transpire throughout the month of Av, all have to go through this inyan of Shabbos Mevorchim. Brought an example like we find Benegei Karbanis. Karbanis we bring a Karban Tamid every single day. That's the first Karban, and that is the last Karban. As we say, Allah Hashleim Kala Karbanis Kulam. This is the last Karban of the day. How about on very special days, even to the extent of a day like Yom Kippur, we also have the opening and the closing of the day has to be with the Karban Tamid. That is the first Karban as well as the last Karban of that day. The same when we're talking about the month of Av, all of the inyanim that will take place during this entire month are all channeled through this Shabbos Mevorchim when we bench the month of Av. Bichlal, the inyan of Shabbos Mevorchim, in general, is something which Yidden got in Golus. In other words, when Yidden were in Eretz Yisrael, and the setting of the new month was with new Eidos, each time witness would come and say they saw the new moon, then there was no procedure of having a Shabbos Mevorchim. It was impossible to have a Shabbos Mevorchim. You couldn't know the Shabbos before which day is going to be Rosh Chodesh and bless the new month. Even in the beginning of Golus, while the Yidden were still in Yavne, there was also a system of Eidos coming saying that they saw the new moon, and then Bezdin would set the new month. However, as it became worse and worse in Golus, this is when there was a need to set up a calendar, and as of then we have this inyan of Shabbos Mevorchim. The names of the months, Bichlal, Chazal tell us, Shmois HaChadoshim Olu Imahem MiBavel. This is something which the Yidden picked up in Bavel, and when they came back from Bavel, that is when they had names for every single month. So originally, the name of the month was Av. It was later when they added on Menachem to the Av, and it became, as we have it now, the month of Menachem Av. What is the inyan which a Yid can take a heroah? What do we have to derive from this whole inyan of Menachem Av and bring it down, practice it into our daily life? The avodah of a Yid, on one hand, Yidden are constantly begging from the Rebishter should make an end to the Golus. As the expression goes, Ad Masei, how much longer, Rabbeinu Shalom, will we be in Golus? To such an extent, as we find in the very first Golus, that the Rebishter promised the Yidden that he will take them out b'rechush godel, making each and every one of them wealthy. It came to an extent where the Yidden said, they will forgive on the Rechush Gadol, they will look away on the Rechush Gadol, as long as the Rabbeinu Shalom should already take us out of Golus. Being that this idea reached us from the very first Golus, and it became part of Torah, so we must say that it applies to us as well. And we are begging from the Rabbeinu Shalom, get us out of Golus as soon as possible. And if there's a question of Rechush Gadol, we're Meichel the Rechush Gadol. If it could mean getting us out of Golus earlier, we are begging Ad Masai, get us out of it. Yidden had enough in Golus. And we're asking for the coming of Mashiach right away. At the same time, it is the tafkid of a Yid to instill the idea of Menachem Av. Menachem is to bring a condolence. Bichlal, we all heard today's Haftarah. Normally we know that a Haftarah has to have a contents of the Sedra. However, in the 3 weeks it is different. So if we listen to today's Haftarah, we noticed that the contents of today's Haftarah is something which deals with the idea of Bein HaMetzarim, with the idea of the 3 weeks. Here the Rebbe said, we know that Chazal tell us, Loksa b'keflayim. The Yidden were plagued, the whole Indian of Golus was plagued, Yidden were plagued double. Therefore, it will be a nechama, the condolence will also be keflayim, will also be double. So the Rebbe asked, if the plague was double, then there's no specialty, there's nothing new in the fact that the condolence will be a double one. The condolence has to be equivalent to the plague. If we loksa b'kiflayim, then what's the nice that will be in a nechama b'kiflayim? Definitely the nechama has to be equal to the plague. The Rebbe said the taich is different. Nechama b'kiflayim 4 times as much. In other words, the plague was kiflayim, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu will express a nechama twice as much as what the plague was. The nechama will be b'kiflayim of the loksa. What is the avodah of a yid? How does a yid instill this idea? We all know that it's the 3 weeks. How do we? And we have to, as just mentioned, as we heard in today's Haftarah. How does a yid live up to bring across the idea of menachem of bringing about nechama, condolence in this month of Av? Rebbe said there's a vote from the Munkacher. The Munkacher Rebbe teicht, Mishenichnas Av mematim besimcha. Says the Shulchan Aruch that as we approach the month of Av, we have to minimize in simcha. The Munkacher teicht different. He teicht Mishenichnas Av. As we enter in the month of Av, mematin. How do we reduce and how do we minimize the inyanim of Av? Bisimcha, dafke through simcha. In the 3 weeks we're not allowed to have inyanim of simcha, so we're talking about a simcha which is permitted in the 3 weeks. What kind of simcha is that? It's the simcha of Torah. Because Torah, Pekudei Hashem Yisharem, is Samchei Leiv. This is what brings simcha. So Mamela, how do we go ahead and fulfill this concept of menachem of bringing condolence on the inyanim bilti retziyim, on the unwilling inyanim which have taken place in this month of Av? We have a koyach to fight this, to express the condolence, dafke through simcha. Through adding in Torah, through learning more Torah, more inyanim of Torah, and Torah mitzvahs, dafke, by this, we express the nechama, we express the menachem anov. Talking in the first sikha, talking about these inyanim, the Rebbe began talking about a Bal Asik. What is the attitude, how a Bal Asik should fear zich al pi Torah? On one hand, we know when one is in business, he has to believe that everything comes from the Rebishter. But at the same time, it is a verachecha Hashem elekecha. The Rebishter gives bracha b'choil asher taseh, whatever you will do. In other words, you have to do something. Once we do something, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give bracha in what we do. However, Torah demands from us, it has to be taseh. It has to be, we have to be involved in the doing of something. However, a Yid cannot just go ahead and open his business, leave the door open, and walk away, and go away to the Beis HaMedrash and sit and learn all day, and he will say that the Rebbe will send him bracha. Here Chazal tell us, Harbe Asu Kerashbi, there were many that did the attitude of Reb Shimon ben Yochai, which was solely involved in learning Torah, V'lo also biyadam, and they did not succeed. Therefore, the attitude of a Yid has to be, on one hand, he has to do something. However, at the same time, it has to be beloi leiv v'leiv. He does not have to put his entire heart into it. In other words, he has to know that he has to do it, and do it properly, and do it accordingly. However, this should be primary by him. This shouldn't be. This is wrong. The Rebbe also quoted what Chassidus teaches. Yigia kapecha ki soichal ashrecha v'toivlach. If you will eat the fruit of the toil of your hands, then you are blessed. And Chassidus stresses, the pasuk uses the expression yagia kapecha, the toil of your hands. Why not yigia rishecha? Where's the haravanya from the head? So this is what a person has to realize, that he's doing, has to be zich misparnes, he has to go through parnasa, there has to be an inyan of asiyah, but he has to know that there's an inyan roishecha, his roish has to be dedicated to inyanam of Torah mitzvahs. Roish reflects the idea of something which is primary. Primary inyan by him has to be in Yonim of Torah, and Yonim of Yiddishkeit, and Yonim of Mitzvahs. However, secondary also comes the inyan of Yegia Kapecha Kisoichal and Ashrecha V'Toivlach when a person does it. And the Rebbe quoted as there's a story about the Baal Shem Tov, that the Baal Shem, when he needed something, he needed an inyan in Gashmias, he would go over to the person whom he needed it from, and would knock on his loden, which is a Yiddish old expression for his window, and would just walk away. And when the Baal Shem Tov was asked, what does this mean? He responded that by doing this, by knocking on his window, he already did an asiyah. He already did something. He did the tasa. And he hopes that whatever he needs will already come. The Rebbe will send him. The Rebbe says, this is how Hasidim relate a story, but at the same time, this was a derech for whom? For the Baal Shem Tov. People like us cannot compare ourselves to the Baal Shem Tov, and we cannot rely that our asiyah, as far as in Yonim of Masa Matn, as far as in Yonim of Parnasa, will be to the extent just to give a knock on a window and walk away, and then rely that the Rebbe will send us the rest. On the other hand, we have to constantly realize that everything comes from the Rebbe. A Yid has to be Maimin Bechaye Lomim Vizereya. There's a pasuk, I think it's a Mishlei. V'hoya imuna sitecha, choisen Yeshuais. So Chazal dash, the Gemara Masechta Shabbos dashes this pasuk on the various Shisha Sidrei Mishnah and all the Sdorim of Mishnayos. And Emuna applies to say the Zroyim. What is the shaykhs of Emuna to say the Zroyim? So Chazal right away explained that what's Zroyim? When a Yid plants, in order, the concept of having parnasa. How does the Yid have his parnasa? As a result of emunah. Maimin bechaye lomim. He believes in the Rabbeinu Shalom and v'zereya. That is when he goes ahead and he plants. The same attitude is required by every parnasa. However, on one hand, it is required an inyan shel asiyah, but at the same time, a Yid has to know that this is something that has to be done b'loy leiv v'leiv. As the Kviyas comes out this year, it is also Parshas Masei. Now, at times, Matos and Masei come together. When Matos and Masei come together, it is really one Sedra. It's not the Pshat that two Sedras on that Shabbos. The Horaya, we do not call up 14 people to the Torah, we call up 7 people to the Torah. It's a siman that on this Shabbos, it is such a Sedra. However, this year, Matos and Masei are not together. It is only Parshas Masei which was read today. And the question arises, why is the name of the Sedra Masei? As discussed in previous years, it says Matos and Masei are really two contradictory subjects. Mata means a stick. A stick reflects firmness. There's a makel, which is a softer stick, and there's a mata, which is a stronger stick, a firmer stick. Mata is a firm stick. Masei means to travel. Traveling, wandering, moving from place to place is the contrary of firmness, which is expressed in matos. However, this week's Sedra is only Masei. However, the question arises, a different question. The Torah tells us about the wanderings of the Yidden. At the same time, the Torah tells us not only did they wander, but after every wandering, they rested. So there was a Masa, which means a wander, a trip, and right afterwards there was a Chanoya, a camping. We see the name of the Sedra is only Masei. Obviously, the name of the Sedra should have included both of the Inyanim, because this is what the Torah tells us about. The Torah tells us about the Yidden traveling as well as the Yidden camping. So, if so, this should have been included in the name of the Sedra. Furthermore, all of the Inyanim that have transpired throughout these 42 journeys, the Inyanim that really took place was once they camped, once there was a Chanoya. So we see that the Torah, for whatever reason, stays away from referring to the Sedra, Masei v'Chanoya, or some other type of name, and the name is only Masei. And apparently, why is it so? In fact, when we look towards the very end of the 42 journeys, the pasuk concludes, "Vayachnu ala yardei mebeis hayishimos adav elashitem ba'avis moav." So what was the final step? The final step was a Chanoya, a camping. And still we see that the name of the Seder is what? Masei, which means travel. The Rebbe explained it. This is the message which this week's Seder brings to a Yid. A Yid constantly has to be traveling, in the spiritual sense. How low a Yid is, we tell him that he has to keep on getting higher and higher and higher. And the same message is brought to a Yid, how high he is. And being that we're talking about a lakus, the journey which he will go, we're talking about in Yonim of Ein Sof, it's an endless journey as well. In other words, there's endless masais, endless travel, spiritual uplifting, going from one level to another constantly, which this is what the Torah is demanding from us. Therefore, the name of the Seder is not Chanoya, which reflects the resting and the camping of the Yidden, because this is not the lesson which we are to derive from here. The lesson which we are to take from this week's Seder is that a Yid constantly has to be an Oiseya. He constantly has to travel. How high or how low he may be, there's still room for him to constantly go higher and higher, endless, Ein Sof, until he will, and again, constantly traveling and going from Madrega to Madrega. And this is the message which this week's Seder has.
Each Yid has to go through the 42 stages in
Did
his
you
life.
mention that?
You did, yeah.
There's a word from the Baal Shem Tov that the Masei, the 42 different journeys which the Torah tells us about in this week's Seder, the same is reflected in each and every Yid. Every Yid goes through 42 different journeys, different levels, different madregas. But here the Torah is telling us furthermore that a Yid constantly has to be an Isaiah, constantly going higher and higher in Avodas Hashem. As it's customary in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe learns a Rashi in this week's Seder, as well as a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, and today it was not only one Rambam, but it was two Rambams. A Rambam in the daily Shia of the three Prokim, in Hilchas Isurei Bia, as well as a Rambam which has a Shayches to the learning of Hilchas Beis HaPrira, which the Rebbe demands from us that during the 3 weeks we be Keveya and learning in Yonim that have a Shayches to the Beis HaMikdash. Benegea the Rashi in this week's Seder, the Rebbe raised two questions in this week's Seder, which apparently both of them should require some sort of an explanation, and Rashi bypasses and does not explain neither of them. The first inyan is at the beginning of the Seder in Kapitel Lamed Gimel, Pasuk Tes. Pasuk tells us, Vayisu memora, the Yidden have traveled from Mora, Vayavayu Elima, they arrived at Elim. Over Elim, what did they find? 12 eines mayim, 12 wells of water, V'shivim tmorim, and 70 palm trees. Vayachanu sham, and that is where they camped. Rebbe says it's something which is very strange. Rashi does not comment anything on it. The Yidden, as they were traveling, there were 600,000 adults between above age of 20, males between 20 and 60. There were younger people, children, there were women. Which means in total, must have been a few million Yidden which were traveling. What does the Torah tell us? The Torah tells us they had 12 wells of water. Fine. A well is something, it wasn't something which was a man-made lake or so. It was something which was a well, and a well constantly has a flow of water. So the Torah tells us that the Yidden had water when they arrived there. What else is the Torah telling us? That they had shivim tamarim, 70 palm trees for millions of people. What kind of value the 70 palm trees have for so many people? If they should grab all the fruit that's on these trees and divide it amongst them, it would definitely would not be sufficient for them. So what would happen? It would lead to quarrels and would lead to arguments. So, and the Rebishter did this, and the Torah is telling us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did such a thing. For what reason was this? And Rashi, who should comment on such a question, bypasses the pasuk and does not tell us anything regarding the Shivim Tmarim which the Yidden found at this particular camping place in Elim. The Rebbe explained, for the child who was learning Chumash, and he's looking through the various journeys which the Yidden have gone through, and he's learning Vayisu Mimara, Vayavayu Elima. The Yidden were in Mara, and they left Mara, and they came to Elima, to Elim. Now in Mara we know there was a bad experience. In Mara, the Yidden complained. That, in fact, that is why it's called Mara, meaning of Mara, Mar, bitterness. There was a lot of bitterness at the camping of Mara. That is where the Yidden had many, many complaints to the Rabbeinu Shalom. What did the Rebishter do? Right after the Yidden left Mara, and they came to the next camping area. And here we see how everything is b'hashgacha pratis, and how everything is planned in advance, and everything is extremely accurate. The child who's learning Chumash already knows that various numbers reflect certain inyanim. As we've learned in Pashas Baloischa, we've learned by Karbonis. He knows, he sees number 12, it has a meaning. Number 12 has a meaning, it stands for the 12 Shvatim. He sees number 70, he as well knows it has a meaning. 70 has a meaning for the 70s Canaan. What HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done here was, after the Yidden had such bitterness, and the Yidden did not act properly, when the Yidden came to the next place, and all this HaKadosh Baruch Hu has planned in advance, because we know that for a Tmarim tree, it takes 70 years to grow. So Memele, while the Yidden was still in Mitzrayim, the Rebishter foresaw everything which is going to happen, and saw to it that there should be Shivim Tmarim once the Yidden will come to Elim. The Einos Mayim which we're talking about wells, so this was definitely there which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this way in advance, and saw what is going to happen when the Yidden will come to Elim, after them being in Mara. And here HaKadosh Baruch Hu came up with two things which were meaningful and expressed his love to the Yidden. Number one, he showed them something which was in a number of 12, which just immediately the child realizes that this has a shaykhus to the 12 Shvatim. Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu did something in number of 70, which has a shaykhus to the Shivim Skenim. And how did the Rabbeinu Shalom relate everything to the Skenim? This was related to the Yidden rather. That first the Rebishter told Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe to Aaron, and then it went to the Skenim. So who were the ones that really taught Torah to the Yidden? It was the Shivim Skenim who related the Torah to the Yidden. So therefore the Rebishter wanted to show right away, after the Yidden were in a place where it did not fulfill the wish of the Rebishter. So immediately as they came to the next place, the Rebishter showed something which expressed the Rebishter's love to the Yidden. He showed them that they'll come to the next place and they will find something which has a number of 12 and a number of 70. So again, in other words, the 70 Tmarim were not there just for the fact that the Yidden should have a fruit that they should eat. There was much more than that. And this the child understands, and there's no need for Rashi to comment. Because the child understands it, because he knows that the numbers of 12 as well as the number of 70 have a significance when we're talking about Klal Yisrael. And in this particular case, we see it's extremely accurate because it comes after the Yidden have gone through the bitterness and Mara. And here HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to do something to show an expression of his love to the Yidden, and he had pre-planned it in advance, and it was an inyan which had a number of 12 as well as an inyan which had a number of 70. Another inyan in this week's Sedra, which requires an explanation, and again Rashi does not explain it, is while we're going through these various masoas, these various journeys, we come in Pasuk Lamed Ches, in the same kapitel. The Torah tells us in detail about Aaron HaKohen, about Aaron HaKohen's passing away. Torah tells us the date when it happened. It was Bishnas HaArboim, 40th year, let's say, B'nai Yisrael, Meretz Mitzrayim. It was B'chodesh HaChamishi, and it was B'echad L'chodesh. The first day of the 5th month, which means Rosh Chodesh Av. And the pasuk goes ahead, and the next pasuk and says, V'Aaron ben Sholosh ve'eschim u'ma'ash shana. Aaron was 123 years old. Masei, when he passed away, b'hoyer hahor. The Rebbe says, if we go through Chumash, we do not find that the Torah should tell us such details about the passing away of anyone else other than Aaron HaKohen. Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. The Torah does not tell us the day. When is the day when Avraham passed away? Moshe Rabbeinu. It was something which was unpopular the day when Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. To such an extent that many, many years later, by Haman, when Haman wanted to come out with a Chas v'Shalom with a Gzeira on Yidden, Haman chose the month of Adar, and the month of Adar also because he knew that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away in that month, and he did not know that Moshe Rabbeinu was also born in that month. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is memalish neseim shel tzadikim miyoyim liyoyim, that he didn't know. So we see that the Torah does not tell us too many details about the passing away of the people who are discussed in Chumash. It comes to Aaron, the Torah gives us a complete report on what day it happened, what year it happened, where it happened, what was the exact age of Aaron, when it happened. And this is something which we do not find anywhere. And again, Rashi does not pay attention to that. Something which requires an interpretation, requires explanation, and Rashi doesn't say anything. Rebbe said we must say that it is that pashut that there is no need for Rashi to explain it. Being that we already read, and Rashi explained, that when Aaron passed away, it was Vayivku Oisoi, Koil Beis Yisrael, the entire Jewish community, everybody, was mourning the passing of Aaron HaKohen. This shows us that Aaron had a shaykhus to each and every Yid. If we go to the Avos, for example, Yitzchak had his problems with Esav. Yitzchak with Yishmael, Yaakov with Esav, Avraham had problems with Nimrod. As we go through, every one of them had certain problems. Aaron HaKohen was the only one who was totally beloved by everyone. There was no one that had anything bad, anything to complain on Aaron. Therefore, when it comes to Aaron's passing away, being that this was an inyan which involved Koil Beis Yisrael, each and every Yid, that is why the Torah feels that it is important to tell us all the details, because this is something which is not just negayah to one segment of Yid nor another segment of Yid nor a third. This is something which each and every Yid was interested in Aaron. The Harayah, that when Aaron passed away, it was Vayivku Oisei Koil Beis Yisrael. If so, when the Torah is telling us the details of Aaron's passing, the Torah finds it important to tell it in all the full details. And being that we're talking about Aaron these days, and these are the days of the month of Av, when we have to do in Yanim to correct the Churban HaBayis, it is most appropriate to talk about Aaron HaKohen, because what led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was the inyan of Sinas Chinam. There was hatred amongst the Yidden. Here we are talking about Aaron HaKohen, who is the one who's giving us an example how we are to introduce an inyan of Avas Chinam, loving one another without any reason, total Avas Yisrael, to the extent of Achdus Yisrael, total unity amongst all of Klal Yisrael. So again, it's extremely appropriate to talk about in these days. B'negeya the Rambam, the Rebbe learned, as mentioned, the Rebbe learned 2 Rambams today. One in Hilchos Beis HaBchira, which again the Rebbe asked now and later in the Farbrengen, before he concluded the Farbrengen. He asked, urged everyone again, very strong, to see to it that during these days of the 3 weeks, and especially the 9 days, we have Kviyas and Torah, learning in Yanim that have a shaykhus to the Beis HaMikdash, beginning from Torah Shebiksav, as it is discussed in Navi Yecheskel, and then as it is discussed in Gemara, until halacha, as the Rambam in Hilchos Beis HaBchira tells us all the details regarding the Beis HaMikdash. And by learning all of these inyanim, this will lead to us having the Beis HaMikdash rebuilt b'meira v'yamein. Rambam says he will choose to discuss today a halacha in the beginning of the 6th perek of Hilchos Beis HaBchira, being that we are in the Elef Hashishi, in the 6,000 of the Bri of the creation of the world. The Rambam starts Perek Vav, Hamikdash kuloi loy haya b'misher, that the Beis HaMikdash was not standing on one even piece of ground, ela b'mayla hahar, but was standing on a mountain. And the Rambam goes ahead describing all the various parts of the Beis HaMikdash, how it kept on going higher and higher, until it came to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which the Kodesh HaKadoshim did not go higher. The Kodesh HaKadoshim was on one even piece of land in the Har HaBayis. So the Rebbe is asking, the Rambam actually is telling us and giving a precise and detailed layout of the Beis HaMikdash. And as we go through the halachas, we see that the Beis HaMikdash was not on an even piece of land, but it was going maila, higher and higher. So why does the Rambam have to open with the words Hamikdash kuloi lo haya b'misher, that the Beis HaMikdash was not standing on an even piece of land, but it was b'mayla, it was on a mountain? Imagine if the Rambam would not say these words, but the Rambam would start describing exactly where the Beis HaMikdash was and how the construction of the Beis HaMikdash was. And as he goes on telling us, it was higher and higher. One part was higher than the other. We get this idea from learning all the halachas. Why does the Rambam have to open with the words Hamikdash kuloi lo haya b'misha ela b'mayla hahar? It is something which, as we go through the halachas, we see that it was not b'misha, but it was b'mayla hahar. The Rebbe Zalman explained. We find the Beis HaMikdash actually came to replace the Mishkan, as the Rambam himself tells us, the beginning of Hilchos Beis HaBchira. However, there's a major difference between the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash. The Mishkan was something which the Yidden traveled with. And as they were traveling, they opened the Mishkan, and then they put it apart, and then they had to fold it up again. They came to a new place, they again had to erect the Mishkan, and as they were ready to leave, they had to fold up the Mishkan. Irrelevant how long they stood at the place. There were some places where they camped longer, and there were some places where they camped only for a day. On this area, where the Mishkan stood, there was no Kedusha. In other words, once the Yidden left that area, the Mishkan was folded up, and the Yidden traveled weiter. If we were to go back to a journey or two ago, where the Yidden stopped, and had the Mishkan on that specific spot did not carry any Kedusha. Once they moved the Mishkan away from there was no more Kedusha to the place. So the Mishkan was built b'mishoyer. The Mishkan was taken not on the format of mountain, of higher and higher. The Mishkan was, each time they had to erect the Mishkan, it was on an even piece of ground. The idea of Beis HaMikdash is a deeper one. The Kedusha of Beis HaMikdash goes stronger. Not as Kedushas HaMishkan, which did not penetrate that the Mokum should become Kodesh. Kedushas Beis HaMikdash goes that even the area where the Beis HaMikdash was built, the Har HaBayis, had a Kedusha. And the Kedusha, to the extent as it is required from a Yid to constantly be a Mahalech, as discussed earlier in Pashas Masei, the same idea is reflected in Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash is built in what kind of a format? Not b'misher, not on an even piece of land. Beis HaMikdash is built on a way that constantly keeps on going higher and higher. As it is demanded from a Yid to constantly keep on going higher. However, when it comes to Kodesh HaKadoshim was the holiest spot. Kodesh HaKadoshim was so halik. It's such a Kedusha that we're talking about, that here it cannot be reflected in any way that we should say that for Kodesh HaKadoshim we should go a little bit higher. the area Kodesh HaKadoshim should be built on, we should say that should be a little higher than the other parts of the Beis HaMikdash. It doesn't pass, it does not fit in. Why? Because the Kedusha of Kodesh HaKadoshim was an Ein Sof Kedusha, it's an unlimited Kedusha. Therefore, this cannot be in any way reflected in the Gashmiistic format of going a little bit higher on the mountain. All other Chalakim of the Beis HaMikdash, the Kedusha does not come to the Kedusha's Kodesh HaKadoshim. It is by far not close to it. It's not an union of Kedusha. That is why the Torah has set it up in such a way that it keeps on going higher and higher. This is what Kedusha wants from us, that we have to go higher and higher. However, when we're talking about Kedusha's Kodesh HaKadoshim, this is a Kedusha which in no way can this be reflected in a Gashmiistic extension of going a little bit higher on the mountain. But the fact that the Rambam is stressing Hamikdash kulei lo haya b'misher ela b'mayla hahar, because the Rambam wants to explain the difference between Mikdash and Mishkan. And that is why the Rambam opens with these words. Mikdash couldn't have been b'misher, but kept on going higher and higher. Because Kedushas Hamikdash was such that brings Kedusha even to the Gashmiistic area where the Mikdash was. However, the Mishkan was something which did stand b'misher, stood on a straight piece of land, and it reflects also in the Ruchnius that the Kedusha of the Mishkan was such which did not penetrate Kedusha into the physical area wherever the Mishkan was erected. Benegei the Rambam of today's Shiurim, as it goes according to the division of 3 prakim a day, it is the Rambam in Hilchas Isurei Biyah. And actually the Rambam in Hilchas Isurei Biyah, that is where the Rambam discusses all the details of Giyur, of Geirus. The Rebbe says the Indian of Giyur Kahalacha is something which we are very much involved in. Therefore, it is appropriate to talk about this Indian of Geirus. The Rambam tells us that how does one become a Geir? Three inyanim. Mila. In other words, there are 3 major inyanim. Mila, Tvila, and bringing a korban. A Geir has to bring a korban. Tzarich Mila, Tvila, v'hartzoas korban. The Ragatshava on this Rambam raises a question. There's another Rambam elsewhere. The Rambam in Hilchis Mechusari Kapara. There the Rambam says that a Geir who did not bring a korban, the Rambam uses the expression, he is, to remind me, he's not Miksheira Yisrael. Thank you. So the Ragatshava asks, if the Rambam considers a Geir that has not brought a korban, that he's not Miksheira Yisrael, why here, where is the source of the Rambam discussing Hilchas Geiros, why doesn't he mention it? So the Ragatshava wants to answer that there's a Lakatchila and there's a B'di'evin. In other words, it is taka advisable for him to bring a korban, but if he does not bring a korban, he's also acceptable. The Rebbe says it is very hard to accept this teretz, especially in light that there is a correspondence from the Rambam himself, which the Rambam writes to Rabbi Vadya HaGeir. There was a Geir in the Rambam's times whose name was Rabbi Vadya, and it seems like there were people who were offending him, and the Rambam wrote him a letter that while Yid not considered Ben Avram, Yitzchak, Bnei Avram, Yitzchak, v'Yankov, a Geir is considered a Ben Elikim, a son directly of the Rebishter. And by writing him this, the Rambam wanted to comfort him. So what do we see? The Rambam wrote a letter to somebody in his generation who definitely was not able to be Makriv a korban, and the Rambam praised him to the extent that he's considered a Ben Elikim. So if we had to say that there's... He was a ger, yes. Yeah. So if we were to say that it's question of look at chila and b'di'evet, in other words, it's advisable he should bring a korban, but if he didn't, it is also good. The Rambam writing a letter to Rabbi Vadia Ger and telling him that he's considered a ben elikim, there's nothing higher than him. He's yet greater than Bnei Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yankov. And here, the Rambam does not mention that had he not brought the korban, he's not considered Miksher Yisrael. Furthermore, let us imagine in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, or between the first Beis HaMikdash and the second. Between the first Beis HaMikdash and the second, if there were Gerim around who was a Mizgayer while there was still the first Beis HaMikdash, and they brought the Korban, they would be considered perfect Gerim. Those Gerim who came into Klal Yisrael after the Churban of the Bayis Rishon, and they were not able to bring a Korban, they would be considered something like secondary Gerim. Let us understand what's going on. The Rambam here does not mention it. The Rambam mentions it only in Hilchas Mechasari Kapara. Why is this? He says we will understand this if we look into the expression Miksher Yisrael. Very strange expression, which is not found. The Rambam could say it's not advisable, it is better if he brought the korban. The Rambam used the expression, if he brought the korban, he's Miksher Yisrael, if not, he's not. What kind of an expression is this? Where do we find the Hagdara, where do we find the concept, the musag of an expression Miksher Yisrael? The Rebbe says the taich Miksher Yisrael stems from the word Shas HaKosher. Shas HaKosher means an opportune time. What is the pshat? If he brought the korban, he is Miksher Yisrael. It's a side thing. He has done something which gives him an opportunity to be able to eat korbanos. Did he not bring the korban? He does not have the opportunity to eat korbanos. However, as far as him being a ger, as far as being considered a yid, as far as being considered a ben elikim, there is no difference whether he brought a korban or did not bring a korban. Therefore, the Rambam here, there is no need for the Rambam to mention that if he does not bring a korban, he's not considered Miksher Yisrael. This is not a halacha in Geirus. It's not a halacha that if he does not have the korban, he's a schwacher ger, he's a weaker ger. That is not so. He's the same ger, he's the same yid, in other words, as the one who has brought the korban. The only thing, the one who brought the korban has also an opportunity to be able to eat korbanos. The only thing that being a korban accomplishes is that it is a heta for him to be able to eat korbanos. And therefore this is something which can only be bisman habayis. Again, nowadays we cannot eat the korban mida. So Mamela, that is what the Rambam means. It's not a question of him being a stronger yid, stronger geir, a stronger yid, or a weaker geir, a weaker yid. He's a full-fledged yid and geir once he's gone through these things. Being that he cannot bring a korban nowadays, only thing he is lacking, the shas hakosher, which means the opportune time of eating a korban, of eating korbanos. Memela, once the Beis HaMikdash will come and we will be able to be makriv korbanos, he as well will bring his korban, and then he will also be able to join in on eating korbanos. This is as far as the Rambam. Benegeya, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, today it was the second Perek. There's a Mishnah in Perek Beis of Pirkei Avos. Mishnah Dalet. Hu haya omer, he would say. Who is the he? Referring back to Mishnah Beis, Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Nossi. What would he say? Asei retzoinoi, keretzoincha. Fulfill his will, the Rabbeinu Shloim's will, as you would your own will. Kedei sheyase retzoincha keretzoinoi, so that he may fulfill your will as though it were his will. What are we talking about? We're talking in Pirkei Avos, which is Mila de Chasidus, as we know. What is Pirkei Avos? In Yonim, which come Lifnim Meshuras Adin. Rabbi Gamliel, we're talking about a sage like Rabbi Gamliel. Hu Haya'ima. What is the expression Hu Haya'ima? The Rebbe always stressed it today as well. Hu Haya'ima means it wasn't a one-time saying by Rabbi Gamliel. It was something which Rabbi Gamliel would quote very often. What was an often quotation of Rabbi Gamliel? Rabbi Gamliel would tell us, Asei Ritzaynai Kirtzayncha. Do the will of the Rebishter as you would do your own will. Is this something of Mila de Chasidusah? This is the basic of Torah. This is not a Mila de Chasidusah, an additional thing beyond the call of duty. In other words, this is something in addition. In addition, for one who's observing everything of Halach and everything of Shulchan Aruch, he's also told, you know what? Asei Ritzaynai Kirtzayncha. And as with all the details as the Mishnah goes on. Something very strange. This is a major yesod, a major fundamental of Yiddishkeit is that we have to fulfill the will of the Rebishter as it will be our will. The Rebbe teaches. We know Chassidus always teaches. There's an expression Yehi Ratzain. What is the meaning of Yehi Ratzain? Yehi Ratzain Tefillah, the koyach of Tefillah goes to such an extent that Yehi Ratzain, it can create a new will. A new will by the Rebishter. What is the Hu Haya'ima from Rabbi Gamliel? Asei Ritzaynai Kirtzayncha. Rabbi Gamliel is instructing us. See to it. Make the will of the Rebishter. That the Rebishter should want the same thing you want. What do you want? Just like you want, it should take an end to Golus. Mashiach should come. Ad Masei. How much longer should we be in Golus? Mashiach should come right away and take us out of Golus. See to it that you should act in such a way that this should become the will of the Rebishter, that the Rebishter should also want to do your will and get you out of Golus. And here the Rebbe referred to the saying from the Frierdiker Rebbe that we're already at the end of Golus, and all that we are missing is that we have to polish our buttons. Frierdiker Rebbe expressed himself that we are all like soldiers in the army. And just like all the soldiers are wearing a uniform, and soldiers not only have to be careful that everything on the uniform should be accurate, but even the buttons, the buttons on their jackets have to shine properly. So the Frierdiker Rebbe expressed himself, we're already at the end of Golus. All we have to do is see to it to polish our buttons. So Mamela, we have to, what the Tana is telling us, Asei Ritzaynai Kirtzayncha. See that his will should be like your will. Memele, Kidei Sheyaseh Ritzayncha Kirtzaynai. Memele, the Rebishter, it's going to become the will of Hashem, and the Rebishter will fulfill it like it is your will. And this is what we are asking for. We are begging. It's another angle, another way how we are begging from the Rabbeinu Shalom that the Rabbeinu Shalom should make an end with Golus. And the Rebbe said that, as mentioned in the previous Farbrengen, that let us hope that even in the middle of a Shabbos, that Mashiach should come and get us out of Golus, and that we're in the middle of a Shabbos afternoon, and we are before Mincha, so Mashiach will take us, with Anana Shemaya, will take us on the clouds, will take us all physically to Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, so that the Mincha of the Shabbos, we will daven in Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh together with Mashiach.